Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to the show. It is Monday, June 2nd, 2014. June is busting out all over. Anyway, we have got so much to talk about today. It's been a very busy news weekend. A lot of developments coming out now. The phone lines are open. 800-313-9443. 800-313-9443. Sam is sitting in our control room, his hand hovering over that phone, ready to grab it as soon as it rings. Now, today, in our third hour, our guest will be David Merland, talking about what he has uncovered after a thorough study of the United States tax code. You've probably heard his ads that are running on the show here, and he says some things in the ad that sort of got my curiosity going. So we're going to have him on in the third hour to sort of elucidate what he has found so far. Friday, June 13th, Dr. Gilbert Levin will be back on the show to talk about life on Mars, and appears to be another case of politics trumping science. We're still trying to finalize the date for Norman Finkelstein to be on the show as well. Okay, and we just lost our connection here. Okay. All right, let's see. Try calling me again. There we go. Okay, and we're back on the air here, and I guess those hackers just, gosh darn it, they don't like what we're talking about here on the show, and so they keep coming in here and messing around with things. Or it could just be the fact that our infrastructure, through decades of neglect, is just falling apart on us. Anyway, I'm not exactly sure how much you heard, but we're going to have David Merland as our third hour guest, talking about what he's found after the Herculean task of studying the U.S. tax code. Now, over the weekend, a couple of very disturbing stories came out. Over on Russia Today, they ran an episode of their program, The Truth Seeker, which has a lot of good information. I'm becoming a major fan of that show, talking about how outside analysis of U.S. weapons development clearly shows the U.S. posturing for a potential unprovoked first nuclear strike on Russia and China. And right now, a lot of people don't understand this. The U.S. government is spending 20% more for the development of new nuclear weapons than they did at the height of the Cold War, and that is adjusting for inflation. Now, we know the U.S. government has been investing heavily in underground bunkers for nuclear war. They built one in the northeastern corner of Griffith Park after the Northridge earthquake. FEMA was making a big deal about all the money that's being brought in to help the victims of the earthquake, and actually very little of it got to ordinary people, and they spent it all, with this huge construction. We had friends in the construction industry, and they were telling us privately, I can't tell you, but I'm going to tell you anyway, kind of a thing about what's going on. Another bunker supposedly under the Denver airport, which is already infamous for those very bizarre murals on display there. We know about places like Mount Weather, Greenbrier. The government loves to build these underground bunkers just in case the nuclear war gets out of control. You paid for it. You will not be allowed into it, of course, here. Now, another very alarming story. The Sunday Times in England is reporting that Israel has deployed 3 nuclear-armed submarines off the coast of Iran. Now, Israel claims they are there to contain Iranian aggression, which is nonsense. Iran has not invaded another country in a war of aggression in over 200 years. But they're basically saying, they're there to act as a deterrent to Iran's aggression, to gather intelligence, and, yes, to send in Mossad agents and other people to cause acts of terror inside Iran. Iran is obviously not very happy about this, but what is really significant, is that these Dolphin-class submarines that Israel got from Germany are now being admitted to have been armed with nuclear weapons. All that nonsense about nuclear ambiguity, that's now out the window. And the reason Israel is doing this, and the reason Israel could just go ahead and attack, is the P5+1 talks seem to be making progress. Iran is doing everything they agreed to do. The United States isn't, but they are. And now we have the corporate media, at least in Britain, acknowledging what we've known for years. Israel is a nuclear-armed state. Now, you remember Barack Obama's first press conference as president, and Helen Thomas asked him a direct question. What nations in the Middle East have nuclear weapons right now? And, of course, Obama did not answer that question. He danced away from it saying, well, we're concerned about proliferation, blah, blah, blah. And the next day, Helen Thomas was kicked off the White House press corps. And she'd been there for, like, many administrations. She was like a foundation and an icon, and she was immediately gotten rid of. And then subject to a smear campaign. How dare you talk about most holy Israel's most holy nuclear bombs and so forth and so on. The corporate media today seems very much obsessed, or maybe it's part of the connoitization process, over this trade of 5 of the Guantanamo prisoners for this one American POW who's been held by the Taliban for a great many years. Now, I got to be very honest. I think it's a good idea they got the guy back. And I am presuming that the Taliban that they let go from Guantanamo are among that 1/3 that the military tribunal already said, look, these guys can be let go. They haven't done anything. They haven't committed any crimes against the United States of America. The United States has no reason to continue to hold them. Of course, the media is saying they're high risk. Doesn't mean they're doing it. We're going to declare them high risk. And they're making a big deal about this over these 5 being let go in order for the return of Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. Now, of course, the reason so many people are concerned about the release of anybody from Guantanamo is that far worse things than waterboarding were being done to these guys, and it's only going to be a matter of time after these guys get over to, I think they're being sent to Qatar. I keep putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable on that country. As soon as they talk to the media, the world's going to find out what the U.S. government has been doing to these prisoners, even though the military tribunal said they were innocent of any crimes. Now, the story about Bergdahl himself is getting a little bit murky because we're hearing from some of his associates in the military that he was very unhappy about being in Afghanistan. He was ashamed of what the U.S. was doing. There's one suggestion that he actually deserted before being captured by the Taliban. But like we saw with that football player, who turned out to be friendly fire killing, and Jessica Lynch, the U.S. government likes to promote their people as heroes, and we're the good guys, and they're the bad guys. I keep seeing those U.S. Navy commercials, the global force for good. No, it isn't. It's a global force to go in and blow up other people's property. We're going to grab a real quick phone call here. Dan in New York. Aloha, Dan. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I heard you talking about the hum, the Windsor hum back there, which is, I find, incredibly interesting. These borrowing machines.
Yes.
But in a sort of on a similar science issue, I'm wondering if you're familiar with the electric universe theory as propounded by the Thunderbolts project.
Yeah, I've heard of it. I've read it. It doesn't really seem to make that much sense to me, to be very, very honest.
Okay.
Okay?
Well, one reason I ask is because if they sort of the guys from it sort of hit some of the main points regarding this global warming fraud that, as you hit, and where they sort of emphasize the electromagnetic sort of field of the sun and the Earth's rotation and elliptical orbit around the sun as being, one of the main influences and for the Earth's climate. And so, given that truth, they're laying out those truths, I figure that, well, maybe some of the electrical universe stuff is true, or maybe it's not.
Well, I certainly the magnetic field of the sun and the planets do interact, but I think they've taken what started as a solid scientific foundation, and they leapt to some unsupportable conclusions. And that's why I tend not to think about them. We got to take a break for commercials, and we will be back after these words from our sponsors. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, turning over to Russia and Ukraine, the violence is escalating dramatically. We're not seeing a lot of this being reported on the American TV news. But apparently, the junta in Kiev is carrying out bomber attacks against the eastern Ukraine, and they are killing civilians indiscriminately. It's an all-out civil war supported by the United States and Europe to make sure those eastern Ukrainian productive regions remain enslaved to the European Central Bank. But it seems they are at cross purposes, because if they're bombing that entire eastern half of the country into rubble, they're not going to get back the economic return that they're struggling for. At this point, I think it's all about ego and vanity. Once we conquer Ukraine, it stays conquered. They're not allowed to just break off and form their own country. What do they think they are, the American colonies? What kind of nonsense? Anyway, apparently we're hearing civilian casualties, 4 women, 3 men, actually a total of over 18. None of the actual military forces of the eastern Ukraine were hit. They're bombing civilian areas. In fact, they bombed an orphanage, is how bad it gets. Gunfire in Luhansk, 5 people killed, 13 injured there. The orphanage that got shelled rather than bombed is in Slavyansk. They're not picking their targets very, very carefully at all. Now, over in the junta, one of the parties that formed the coalition for the new coup d'etat government likes to call itself the Freedom Party. We're the Freedom Party, and they are now demanding the immediate imposition of martial law in the southeast of Ukraine. Yes, we stand for freedom, but we're going to point a gun at you anyway. It's all about money. It's all about territory. Now, we commented on this last week, where Poroshenko, now that he is the installed by massive vote fraud head of a government installed by force, following the ouster of the elected government, also by force, all of a sudden he's dragging his heels about signing the agreement to merge with the European Union, because Ukraine, even under the junta, is still very much economically dependent on their exports to Russia. The bombs and bullets may be flying, but business is business, and its business is brisk, and it's continuing. And we're seeing more indications where Poroshenko, maybe the fact that he's now the president of Ukraine, it's gone to his head, and he's out there saying, I'm going to do the job the way I think it ought to be. So we're looking at this article over at valdeclub.com. The headline reads, Poroshenko may prove an unpredictable partner for Europe. He can't be relied on to toe the line. He can't be relied on to do what the European central bankers want, which is austerity on the people and wealth for themselves. So apparently Barack Obama feels he now has to go over and sort of remind Poroshenko of the realities of his term in office. And apparently today Obama is on his way on a European tour in which he will meet with Poroshenko in Warsaw. And Obama is also going to visit Poland and Belgium and France and stand up there and hope that they can find some kind of a crowd to wave at him and cheer and wave American flags and so forth and so on. So that's where he's going right now. Now, another episode of The Truth Seeker from over on Russia Today was called NATO False Flags in Ukraine, and it is a very well-produced look back at all the false flags we have seen throughout history. It's rather ironic. I'm working on a similar video, but theirs is very slick, very well documented. They got a lot of graphics and information. You do need to watch that video because we're seeing more and more of this same stuff. This government has gotten by so long with false flags and overthrow of other countries covertly. They're still doing it. They're doing it down in Venezuela. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, an interesting article, historic Syrian election brings multitude of voters. Now, the elections inside Syria itself are due to occur tomorrow. But all over the world, anywhere that there are Syrian expatriates, they are allowed to go to the local Syrian consulate and vote in the upcoming election. We saw huge, gigantic crowds of Syrian refugees living in Lebanon who lined up to vote at the Syrian consulate there. And, of course, Assad overwhelmingly won. I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. Interestingly enough, in some countries, the local governments are refusing to allow the Syrian expats to go to the Syrian consulate to vote, including the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, and others. They seriously said, you may not go to the Syrian consulate to vote in your nation's elections. They're trying to find some way to derail this. Over at CNN, they ran a story, and I had to take them to task on this one. Syrian elections, outcome hardly in doubt, in grotesque parody of democracy. And they're already out there with the spin that this election's a complete fraud. Pay no attention to it. Assad is evil. We must invade. Forget about all the votes going on there. And I took CNN to task because we had Egypt's Sisi won his election by first outlawing the opposition, and the U.S. and media declared it democracy in action. Now, Poroshenko took over Ukraine by force and then tried to legitimize his rule with an election that was so rigged. We had photos of stacks of neatly folded ballots at the bottom of these transparent ballot boxes. And the U.S. and the media are declaring that democracy in action. The United States has raised vote fraud to an art with the new electronic machines. And the United States has not had a national election that was honest, transparent, or verifiable in decades. And the U.S. and media declare it democracy in action. Now, Assad won by a landslide in early voting in Syrian refugee camps in elections that international observers declared to appear to be honest because they're the old-fashioned kind with a paper ballot and a hand count. And everybody's allowed to sit around and watch the hand counts. And the U.S. and the media are out there to say, oh, it's a fraud, it's got to be a fake, it couldn't possibly be real. Because when Assad wins re-election, it yanks the rug out from under the U.S. government's public justification for supporting a covert coup d'etat for the last 3 years, just as it supported the coup in Iran in 1953, the coup in Chile in 1973, the coup in Ukraine, dozens of others, including one happening now in Venezuela. Since the end of World War II, the United States has attempted to covertly change the government of some 50 different nations, succeeding so far 26, 27 times. This is how they've been bringing the American empire into being. They were hoping you weren't going to notice. They were counting on the people in these countries that were regime change not noticing and then just obediently following their new government like they did the old. That's what went wrong in Ukraine. Everybody in eastern Ukraine said, this is not a government we voted for. This is a government put in by power by Western interests, and we're under no obligation whatsoever to listen to them. We're going to form our own countries, which is why they're now being bombed and strafed. Because, by golly, when the United States overthrows a government and conquers a nation covertly, you stay conquered or bad things will happen to you. Meanwhile, over in Turkey, citing their own lowered water supply, Ankara has suspended pumping of the Euphrates water to Syria and Iraq. Now, there are treaties that say this water will be provided to these other countries that really need it, and now Ankara is starting to turn off the valves. This is going to drive the situation in Syria to new heights of insanity, and that may be the goal. But the unintended consequence is it's going to do the same thing in Iraq, and the U.S. isn't doing really good in Iraq. They're just barely hanging on there. In fact, in May, 800 people were killed in Iraq, two-thirds of them civilians. We'll be right back. Oh, hi, America. Welcome back to the show. Now, to sort of finish up on what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, Russia has just announced that if NATO starts moving any more military assets close to Russia's border, Russia is going to have to respond to protect themselves against what they correctly see as a military threat. So everything's ratcheting up and everybody's moving the weapons into position. And the United States is now giving Ukraine, the junta in Kiev, $18 million in direct military aid. Bombs, bullets, armored vehicles, all of that stuff that the junta in Kiev is using to kill the Ukrainian people. Now, the reason the United States is ultimately going to lose this new world war, certainly in the court of world opinion, is the inconsistency in their explanations for why they have to invade all these countries. I mean, for the last 3 years, we have been hearing the U.S. government saying the government of Syria is killing the Syrian people, so we have to invade to get rid of that evil government. And now we have the government in Ukraine is killing the Ukrainian people, so let's give them more weapons with which to do it. Remember what I said about for propaganda to be successful, it has to present a consistent illusion of the reality they want you to believe. And they've lost that. This is what happens when you start turning over the nation's propaganda to marketing companies and advertising agencies who don't think any longer than 30 or 60 seconds into the future. And that's why this is all falling apart, and nobody is buying any of these official stories any longer. Now, as you're probably already aware, the globalists up at Bilderberg have their knickers all in a twist because all their carefully laid plans to create a one-world government enslaved to a one-world privately owned central bank are starting to fall apart. And the biggest hammer blow were the recent European Parliament elections, where the globalists got kicked out and the Eurosceptics got in. Nigel Farage and his UKIP party scored huge gains in Great Britain. He could actually wind up as the new prime minister. And so, of course, all the supporters of the New World Order are out there in absolute goose-step lockstep, sieg-heiling the New World Order and attacking Nigel Farage. Tony Blair, who you think would be keeping a low profile now during the Chilcot inquiry, is out there attacking Nigel Farage, and he's saying, again, they started this last week, you're racist. You're a racist if you don't agree to open borders and have foreigners just coming on into your country and helping to drive down wages and salaries. They're trying to figure out a way to drop the borders, and people inside countries say they want the borders up, just like in the United States. We want that border with Mexico to be enforced. There is a legal means for people to come into this country and become citizens. And if they do that, if they follow those, then welcome. Come on in. Go to Disneyland. Join our community. But this idea that the New World Order wants to simply drop all the borders and everybody gets to run all over the place, regardless of the economic damage it causes for ordinary people, the world is standing up to that. So Tony Blair is leading the charge against Nigel Farage, saying that, he's just a racist for opposing the European Union. And apparently Tony Blair is out there saying, well, if the Eurosceptics won that many seats in the European Parliament, maybe it's time to reorganize that Parliament to make sure that only, New World Order and globalists and Bilderbergers are allowed to make the decisions any longer. We can't have an opposing point of view, which is what Sisi did in Egypt. He outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. That would be like in this country if the Republicans got control of the Congress and the White House, declaring the Democrats to be illegal. Which makes it really easy to win an election when you've outlawed your opposition. Now, getting back onto that Chilcot inquiry, there are now calls for Tony Blair to be charged with contempt of Parliament. Now, yes, it's a wrist slap like contempt of Congress here in the United States of America. But everybody's becoming very, very angry over the fact that the British government is trying to keep the lid on the discussions between Tony Blair and George Bush that got us into that war in Iraq, because we all know they were lying through their teeth, whether it was the dodgy dossier, the forged Niger uranium documents, or Saddam's nuclear weapons. We were lied into that war. And they know we know. What they're trying to do is to prevent there being any kind of an official or corporate media acknowledgement that we were lied into that war, because then it's all going to unravel, and everybody's going to say, well, we were lied into Iraq, we were lied into Syria, we were lied into this place and that place, and haul the rest of it back there. So they're out there saying, we got to charge Tony Blair with contempt of Parliament. I got a better idea. Let's waterboard the guy. I mean, Great Britain and the United States and the rest of this so-called coalition of the willing made it acceptable to resort to such methods to find out what's really going on, or at least to generate a politically convenient confession. I think it's time that we took some of these authors of the war and give them a good wetting down here. All right, we're going to take a phone call. John in Barbados. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, I was going to talk about Ukraine and this Paul Craig Roberts article on American exceptionalism that apparently Barack Obama made reference to at West Point. However, now you've introduced the Bilderberg, I want to make this point on the Bilderbergs. We know who they are. We know their faces. We know where they live. We know what businesses they run. Very soon, they better be very careful and walk safe. And it's sooner than they think.
Well, I hate to break it to you, but they're already living lives behind armor plate for that very reason. These are not people who go down to the local shopping mall. They have hired workers to do their shopping and buying for them. If they have to go out in public, they're in armored limousines. It's not just the President of the United States who drives around in armored cars. You know, armored versions of regular automobiles are a big business in the United States of America. There are companies, in fact, there was a documentary about it in I think it was the History Channel, where there are companies all over the United States who will take high-end cars like Mercedes and Rolls and whatever, and they will go in and modify them with leak-proof fuel tanks, puncture-proof tires, bulletproof windows, Kevlar in all the body panels, to basically allow these people to drive around. And you look at them, and unless you're looking really closely, you don't realize they're driving in these bulletproof cars, and they're already doing that. When the management of Goldman Sachs comes to work in the morning, the New York Police Department literally cordons off the entire block in front of their building and then lets their cars in. They get in their private elevator, they go up to their office, and only then is foot traffic and car traffic allowed to go through again. Same thing when they leave at night. When I was in New York for the 10th anniversary of 9/11, my wife and I walked over to Wall Street just so I could get a picture of myself poking my finger in the nose of that bull statue. But while we were there, we were rather amazed at all the barricades and that are already built into the pavement and the streets. It's already there. They flip a button. All this stuff rises up out of the ground to fortify Wall Street against an enraged American people. They know that we're angry.
Well, I don't know whether you've looked on the net recently, but there's a huge sale to the public of tanks. Well, obviously, the guns are not functional, but the tanks are rather powerful, heavy vehicles. And I don't think these Mercedes would stand much of a chance against one of those. But anyway, you can buy them from $3,000 to $80,000 to $1.4 million.
Yeah, but those Mercedes and everything can outrun those tanks. They have the advantage of speed, you know, because they'll
advantage of speed, yes.
Yeah,
but they're not faster than an RPG-8, Michael.
Well,
but anyway, let me get back to Paul Craig Roberts.
Yes,
who's he said American exceptionalism. Well, from my perspective, this American administration are exceptionally stupid, exceptionally brutal, and exceptional liars.
Well, I'm going to disagree with that. I'm going to have to let you go because we're coming up on a commercial break here. They're not exceptional liars anymore because nobody is believing the lies. They're just continuing to do it because that's what they've always done, and they don't have any clue another way to get what they want. So they're going to go on lying. And, and their attitude now is if you're a loyal American, you will believe the lies. Remember that video we put back up of Obama saying, if you can't trust us, we have a problem. Well, yes, Mr. President, we have a problem. And you made it, and your predecessor made it, and the Congress made it, and all these government agencies made it because they have been lying to us about everything. It's all lies. And if you've got a credibility crisis, you made it yourself, and I have no sympathy for you. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And earlier when we lost our connection right at program start, I offered the possibility that it was either declining infrastructure or malice, and I think I have to go with malice now because the server for my website is now under massive denial of service attack. We're trying to get in there and firewall the miscreants, but that is now off the air as well. So obviously we're telling you something that somebody else doesn't want you to be thinking about. Now, getting back to the news here, this is over in the Daily Mail, where Tony Blair, and again, you would think at the moment with all of this Chilcot inquiry going on, he'd be keeping a low profile, but no. Tony's out there, and he's out there telling Germany's Merkel he will protect the European Union from all these Eurosceptics. How dare they decide that maybe this turned out to be a bad deal for them, and it did. The European Union has been a tremendous blessing for the European Central Bank, and it's been a raw deal for everybody else, whether it's Cyprus, Greece, France, Italy, Spain, It's reached the point where the King of Spain is now going to abdicate, turn the whole thing over to his son, because Catalonia is breaking off, the Basque region is breaking off. Nobody wants to be part of these giant global empires any longer because it means austerity and suffering and poverty and work for them. They just want to go on there. They want to be left alone. And there's speculation that Tony Blair may try and run for president of the European Union. Now, at this moment, he's officially denying it. But it seems to be the direction he's going in terms of these comments he's making to Merkel. As we mentioned, Spain's King Juan Carlos is going to abdicate, and his son Philip is going to take over, deal with that whole mess. More and more people are looking at Sisi's victory in Egypt as seeing that it lacks legitimacy because of the low voter turnout. And we know there was fraud going on. And, of course, you should be able to win an election when you have outlawed your opposition party. Thailand's army is deploying thousands of troops against their protesters. You will accept your role in life to be workers, breeders of soldiers, and providers of wealth to the elite. That's your proper role. That's what you will do here. Jordan is now telling their citizens to leave Libya as soon as possible. It looks like Libya is going to go into a meltdown. Over in South Sudan, now, if you've not been following that, South Sudan just broke off and became independent from Sudan with U.S. support. Remember all that talk about how the preservation of territorial integrity was paramount, which is why the U.S. is spending your tax money to send bullets and bombs and everything to the junta in Kiev. Well, what's going on here in Sudan is the U.S. government assisted South Sudan from breaking off and forming their own country. Now, South Sudan's foreign minister is complaining that the U.S. seems to have the attitude that they can come in and simply take control of South Sudan's oil resources. Well, what do you think the U.S. was doing? Do you think the U.S. went in there and helped you set up your own country so that you could run your country for your own benefit and the benefit of your people? Of course they want control of the oil. They want that oil to sell around the world only for the U.S. dollar. That's the game here. Over in Yemen, apparently half of their population are on the verge of starvation. And they're saying basically the United Nations Food Agency just doesn't have the resources to deal with all of this hunger and poverty and joblessness around the world being caused by this campaign for the money junkies. Now, over in Palestine, this morning they swore in their unity government. Remember when Fatah and Hamas said, we're going to form one new government. And this is a major problem for Israel because for decades, Israel has played this little game. As long as there was more than one government body or ruling body in Palestine, Israel could say, we can't have peace talks with them. We don't know who to talk to. When Yasser Arafat was putting together the PLO, Israeli intelligence services, Shin Bet, set up Hamas. Hamas was originally part of an Israeli-controlled opposition so that Israel could say, well, I don't know if we should talk to PLO or Hamas, so we don't have to talk peace. Then Yasser Arafat was assassinated, PLO collapsed, and all of a sudden Hamas was the de facto government of Palestine. So Israel, again, set up Fatah to keep that duality of governments. We don't know who to talk to. And now they've merged together, and Israel doesn't know what they're going to do. Netanyahu is already out there screaming that the rest of the world's government shouldn't recognize the new government of Palestine. And I wish he would shut up because I'm sick and tired of his constant whining. And to sort of hammer home the point, Israel apparently staged another incursion into Gaza. For no particular reason, gunfire is being exchanged. Apparently, the Israelis are just firing on Palestinian homes. And sort of upping the ante, okay, Economic Affairs Minister Naftali Bennett has said that the only response that Israel can make to this joint Fatah-Hamas unity government is the immediate annexation of the West Bank. Because how dare they have a government we don't approve of? Same attitude we're seeing with the United States towards Syria or any place else they're invading. They have to have a government we like, or we will go on in there. Meanwhile, Mordecai Vanunu, who has finished his sentence of 18 years in solitary confinement for blowing the whistle on Israel's nuclear program, which we now know he was telling the truth because even the Sunday Times in London is reporting that Israel's Dolphin-class submarines are carrying nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. And he was Mordecai Vanunu was invited to London for 3 days to attend a conference sponsored by Amnesty International and to address the British Parliament. The Israeli government said, no, you may not go. You're not allowed to go anywhere or talk to anybody. So for all intents and purposes, he's still in prison. They're still holding him prison. House arrest. Because he made it impossible for Israel to go on saying, well, maybe we have nuclear weapons and maybe we don't. And by the way, a little reminder, with that admission by the Sunday Times that Israel's Dolphin-class diesel-electric submarines are carrying nuclear-armed cruise missiles, it is against United States law for the government to give Israel any financial assistance at all. It's a violation of the Symington Amendment to the Foreign Appropriations Act. It's a violation of the Glenn Act. Every penny of your tax dollars sent to Israel is a criminal act by the government of the United States of America. So, of course, what's going to happen over at Ohio? They've put up a $2.3 million Holocaust memorial in front of the Ohio State House. I seem to remember a part of that First Amendment about government not respecting any institution of religion, and yet they got this big Star of David out there. Huge, gigantic thing. It was on Fox News here a little while ago. Oh, yes, we must believe in the Holocaust. We must always enshrine the Holocaust and dare not allow anybody to question what's going on. Meanwhile, we've got a congressman, Eliot Engel, who is vowing to work to keep Jerusalem the undivided capital of Israel. Well, he's a little behind the times because Jerusalem is divided by the United Nations. The Christians get a section. The Jews get a section, the Muslims get a section, and there's a fourth group in there whose name eludes me at the moment. And I would think with all the problems that we have, especially in the state of New York, which is where Eliot Engel is from, that the voters of New York tell him, look, you let Israel take care of itself. Your job is here in the United States of America, making our lives better. Not working on the taxpayer's dollar and the taxpayer's perk and all the rest of that to go off and do something for Israel. All right, there's the music. We got to head on out of here. I got to see if I can get my server back up and online, and we'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here, and the What Really Happened website is now back up and running, so we got that taken care of here, and welcome to hour number 2. So I was in the process of chastising Congressman Eliot Engel. He's a Democrat from New York. Now, New York's got lots of problems. And the New York voters need to ask themselves, why is this guy spending his taxpayer-funded time and energy and resources worrying about Jerusalem in Israel on the other side of the world? Does he not have things he should be taking care of here at home? And I hope that you will all remember that this coming November. Because right now, America needs leaders who will put America first, second, and third. And tinkering with other countries has to come way down on the bottom of the list here. Unfortunately, with our current regime, tinkering with every other country on planet Earth appears to be their number one top priority. Now, getting on back to Israel itself, apparently one of their top economists is saying that Israel is facing an economic collapse, and for exactly the same reasons the United States is. All the wealth is being concentrated in a few hands at the top, and ordinary Israelis are having to deal with extreme hardships. Remember, about a year and a half ago, they actually set up a guillotine in a public square in Tel Aviv. They're feeling the hardships. They're feeling austerity. Apparently, Israel's government is so greedy to make sure that they know where all the money is. They're actually looking at legislation to outlaw cash entirely inside Israel. Everything will go through a little plastic card. So the banks get their piece of the action of everything that you do, from buying an ice cream cone to magazine, postage stamps, and the bank gets a piece of the action, and the government knows every single thing you are doing. Now, a week ago, we were seeing this horrible story of a shooting at the Jewish Museum in Brussels. And, of course, we are getting, it's anti-Semitism, it's the Muslims, it's this, it's that. It's turned out that one of the Israelis who was killed at the museum was a Mossad agent. One of the other people who was shot worked for an Israeli government agency called Nativ that engages in some activities inside Brussels related to Israel. Now, down in South America, Venezuela, the engineered, paid-for protests are turning violent. This is a repeat of what we saw in Kiev a couple of months ago. There's protesters, they're turning violent. Maduro has to resign, get him out. It's a step-by-step replay of what we saw happen in Kiev. And we're looking at this article over in Blacklisted News saying, there's a plan for a coup d'etat and assassination of Maduro. The U.S. government's been trying to get a sympathetic puppet regime into Venezuela for ages. They tried a coup d'etat against Hugo Chavez. That didn't work. And now that Hugo Chavez has passed away and Maduro's in the leadership, he's still selling Venezuela's oil for currencies other than the dollar, and that's why the United States is out to get him. In fact, there's an article over in S.J. Lindman Blogspot that Washington wants Maduro dead. And that is exactly the desperation they have right now to complete this agenda of restoring the world to the slavery of Bretton Woods and making sure that all the world's resources are traded for only in the U.S. dollar so that the U.S. financial system gets their mafia-like piece of the action of everybody else's trade. Now, at the end of World War II, the idea of a generally accepted international currency made some sense. The whole idea had been started by the British Empire. If you're going to deal with us, you will deal in pounds sterling. You will borrow your banknotes from the Bank of England at interest, which is what led to the American Revolution. But in this day of instantaneous funds transfers all over the world and instantaneous conversion, calculation of relative value, there isn't really a reason for there to be a single global currency. There's no advantage to everybody going through the U.S. dollar. They can trade currencies right across their own border. The U.S. is trying to drag the world back to what it was 100 years ago. And the world doesn't want to go. There's no reason for there to be a global currency any longer, other than in the minds of the New World Order fanatics who want to enslave all of humanity to a global version of private central banking. That's what they're after. And just like a multiplicity of nations is going to work to the benefit of the people in those nations, a multiplicity of currencies is going to prevent monopolistic control and exploitation of the people. That's where we are. Story coming out from this Philadelphia Inquirer co-owner Lewis Katz was apparently reforming the Philadelphia Inquirer to try and rebuild it back up to the newspaper it used to be. And remember, back in the 1990s, it was the Philadelphia Inquirer that broke the story of the abuses of the civil forfeiture laws. So he was putting this deal together, and unfortunately he and 6 others were killed in the crash of a small business jet shortly after takeoff from an airfield outside Boston. And this happened just 4 days after they put together this $88 million deal to gain control of the Philadelphia Inquirer. A lot of small planes going down all over the place. Speaking of wet work, which is what we're talking about, it's been 10 years now since the death of Dr. David Kelly. And these days, even the British media are saying, yeah, it does look like he was killed to silence him. And the government said, oh, yeah, it's a suicide. It's just really, it's a horrible suicide here. Same thing with Vincent Foster, which is what got me started on this whole situation. Over at a website called suspiciousdeaths.blogspot.fr, and it's worth taking a look at, is a reminder that British Foreign Secretary Robin Cook, who was the man who revealed that Al-Qaeda was working for the CIA, that Al-Qaeda was the name of that CIA database of U.S.-trained mujahideen, died. Was just walking along, was walking for health in perfect health, all of a sudden falls over dead. A lot of wet work going on. Now, Al-Qaeda, the literal translation of Al-Qaeda means the base. And that's why it was used as the name for the database of these mujahideen fighters working for the United States government in Charlie Wilson's war. But in Arabic slang, Al-Qaeda means a toilet. And Araish Al-Qaeda means I'm going to the bathroom. And obviously, if you are a genuine Muslim terrorist network, you're not going to run around calling yourself the toilet. It's another made-up hoax. It's another Emmanuel Goldstein to wag at you, to keep you afraid, obedient, and servile from the Department of Redundancies department here. Now then, I want to get back to this tragic shooting over in Santa Barbara. It is now confirmed that Elliot Rogers, who was the stabber/shooter, maybe there were witnesses who insisted there was a second person in the car doing the actual shooting, but this Elliot Roger was taking Xanax in the days before the mass killing spree. And in fact, his family said he was probably taking too much of it. It's even mentioned in his manifesto, to end my life, I will quickly swallow all of the Xanax and Vicodin pills I have left, blah, 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 blah. Now, Xanax is definitely on the list of these prescription psychiatric medications that can provoke intense rage, paranoia, uncontrollable anger, and violence. It's the pills that are doing it. Remember last week they were saying, isn't it strange that all of these mass shootings are from kids from wealthy parents who could get them psychiatric treatment, and then they melt down? It's the treatment doing it. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, we're talking about these medications. We've talked about them for months and months now. How these prescription psychiatric medications have a long proven history of triggering extreme violence. Because of the public awareness, many of these products now include on their little package inserts in microscopic printing a warning that, yes, if you take this medication, you can just flip out completely. And we're not responsible because, after all, we have warned you in this half-point type. We know 25% of Americans, 20 to 25% of Americans are on some form of these medications. The police have a higher per capita usage of these medications, which goes a long way to explaining their treatment of the American people. Article over at naturalnews.com, over 10,000 American children are now on mind-altering medications for ADHD. Now remember, the guy who came up with that term, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, admitted shortly before he passed away that it was a completely made up, out of thin air condition used to sell these medications to parents and schools to give to their kids. Now, when I was a kid, we saw that kind of situation in the classroom, and we called it what it was. Teacher is boring the crap out of us. They're pandering to the dummies and the kids who know what's going on and they're smart. There's nothing to hold their attention. They look out the window. But everything that goes on today in our society is declared a mental illness for which there is an available costly prescription drug, which may make the situation worse. In fact, I was looking at somebody was commenting in the chat room that he'd been in this wonderful marriage, and then all of a sudden the doctor gave his wife this Xanax, and she went completely postal, and their marriage ended. And I've seen it happen to a lot of people who are put on these medications. by their doctors. I had a bad experience with them once myself many, many years ago. So, of course, in the face of this growing public awareness that these medications are causing a lot of problem, House Democrats are introducing a gun control bill targeting the mentally ill in wake of the Isla Vista shootings. They want to have a law that says if you're mentally ill, you're not allowed to buy a gun. Now, on the face of it, this seems like a reasonable course of action, and were we in any other situation politically, I would tend to agree with it. The problem is, once they get an exception to the Second Amendment where they can block your ownership of guns because you're mentally ill, they're going to start changing the definition of mentally ill. I mean, according to the National Institute of Mental Health, they're already claiming 26% of Americans suffer from mental illness. So that's 26% of Americans that are going to be denied their Second Amendment rights. They've been trying to declare that all returning war veterans are suffering from PTSD en masse as a class. If you're a returned veteran, you're presumed to be mentally ill, suffering PTSD, so you can't have guns. We saw this article over at tetrahedron.org from a so-called mental health professional declaring that anybody who doesn't trust the U.S. government, they're obviously mentally ill. Same tactic they used in the former Soviet Union. So given the tendency of this government to try and pass a law for noble reasons and then immediately mutate it and pervert it into something unconstitutional, no, I don't think so. I don't think so. If you want to take guns away from somebody with a history of crime and violence, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. But if you say guns can be banned because somebody is mentally ill, at the way mental illness is just thrown around, because there is no actual scientific test for mental illness. It's all subjective on the part of the practitioner. There's no meter they can hook up to that says this person is mentally ill. If there was, we'd have a field day over in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street with all the sociopaths over there. All right, we're going to take some phone calls here. David in Boston. Aloha, David. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Michael. Michael, I'll tell you what I'd like to run past you. What's kind of crystallizing in my mind is I order the RBN business cards and I pass them out. I'm very active in my community. I pass them out at churches. I try to pass them out at churches, but also I frequent a lot VA hospitals and VA clinics and VA facilities. But what I'm hearing more and more recently when I try to pass them out, Michael, is, oh, no way. The NSA is watching us, and I'm not going to visit if I tell them a little bit what RBN is like, oh, no, I'm not going to visit that site. I don't want to get my name on a list. And there's all this fear, and you can hardly even pass out these cards anymore. It used to be relatively easy, but since Edward Snowden and the NSA, people are paranoid. Well, anyways, where I'm going with this, Michael, over 3 years ago, Hillary Clinton began warning the globalist organizations, whether it's the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and just the globalists in general. There's a whole bunch of their organizations. She began, I don't want to use the B word. I don't know if I can use the B word, but complaining. And you know what the B word for complaining?
I know. I got that. I got it in context.
Yeah. Well, she was whining that, are warning these globalists that, hey, we are losing the information war. In other words, like the true information that's coming out over RBN is overpowering our disinformation, our disinformation, and our propaganda and everything. But I think more and more I'm beginning to think that the solution that the globalists came up with to reverse this loss of the info war, Michael, is Edward Snowden. I think he's a tool of the globalists, and I think they're just using him to spread all this fear where patriots are afraid to even keep in contact with other patriots. They're afraid to send emails to each other. It's just thrown a wet blanket, Michael.
Well, I understand that's a possibility. In fact, when this whole NSA scandal broke, I speculated on the show that maybe this was something that the government wanted to try and scare us into silence, but it obviously hasn't worked. Now, when you're going into places like the VA, you're talking to people who are dependent on the goodwill of the federal government, and they're going to be afraid. That's why the government's trying to get everybody on food stamps, get everybody dependent so we won't fight back. But the backlash is that people are now out there writing their own codes and encryption systems, and the very people the government most needs to be looking at now have made their communications invisible. And it's caused all kinds of financial harm to the American computer industry, computer services industry. It looks to me like if this was a deliberate plan, it has not produced a very strong result and has, in fact, had a serious downside economically. It certainly has not helped America's image around the world. And has caused all kinds of diplomatic problems. So if it was a deliberate plan, they didn't think it all the way through. It seems to have caused a lot more problems than it solved. Certainly hasn't stopped me from talking to anybody.
Yeah. It just seems to have thrown a wet blanket, Michael, on just the normal forces of democracy.
I haven't seen that around here. Quite the opposite. People are now speaking out. They're angry. They're absolutely angry.
What are you talking about? Hawaii, Michael, now, when you say you haven't seen it around here?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Because when I go out, I go to supermarkets, I go to the post office, and I'll talk to people openly. And 3 months ago, they sort of would nod and say, yeah, I think you're right. Today, they come back and say, oh, you're right. It hasn't worked. It's failing miserably. Got to let you go, David. Got to take a commercial break. Back with George in Texas after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go back to the phones. George in Texas. George, aloha. Welcome back to the show. What's on your mind?
Well, how you doing, Mike? Speaking about those SSRIs, Friday night I had to call the sheriff's department out because the neighbors were freaking out because the other neighbor who's on SSRIs, he was cutting himself and he was taking an exhaust pipe, taking a hose, sticking an exhaust pipe, was going to start the engine, have it carbon monoxide flood the car. He was talking to angels. He was talking to demons.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, I found out it was the medication doing it. But this happened 5 times. I found out that he'd been sent under observation because the medication made him suicidal. And I told his wife, I said, why don't you just get him off the medication altogether? Because I don't see this medication really doing him any good.
The doctor said it was a good thing, and the TV commercial said it was a good thing. And, because I love my child, I have to buy him these chemicals and everything. And I don't know if you remember, years ago, there was an amazing movie. When Sean Connery quit being James Bond, he wanted to get away from that role as quickly as possible. And he got himself a major role in a film called Zardoz, which was based on a very popular book, and the film is a cult classic. And part of the motif of the movie is this giant stone head that flies through the air, and it's constantly proclaiming, the gun is good, the penis is bad. And I almost feel like we're in a different mode of that same religious icon out there saying, the pill is good, the gun is bad. And that's certainly what we're getting from Washington, D.C. these days.
Well, I just think, the thing is, for people being mentally ill, they want to ban guns for being mentally ill. Why don't we just ban all the politicians having guns because they're narcissists, so that's mental illness.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with you. This ability to lie the nation into war and steal everybody's money without a shred of guilt, that is classic sociopathic behavior. But what is really important to understand is these medications are given to people who don't have any mental illness, and then it develops, so they give them a new pill. There was this horrible story, I wish I could find it again, about this woman in Britain. She was in her 20s, and the doctor just sort of said, yeah, this is going to make you a little bit, and she was perfectly okay, perfectly functional. And they gave her this psychiatric medication, and it started producing bizarre symptoms. So they switched her to a different medication. That made things worse. They switched her to another medication. The idea of simply stopping all the pills never occurred to them, and she went through about 15 different medications and wound up in a mental home. And if you go over to ssristories.com, one of the stories that really stands out is this kid in school was put on the medication, and all of a sudden he tries to commit suicide. And they get to him in time, and they save his life. And when it's all over, and they say, "Why did you want to kill yourself?" And he says, "I don't know. It just popped into my head, and I couldn't stop myself." And like I said, I had a really bad experience with these medications myself, and I will never, ever, ever take them again. And it is a problem. And Friday, I got interviewed on a rival radio network where that was the topic of discussion, where they were starting to say, kids from poor families who are dealing with depression and anxiety and the stress of being from a poor family, they're not going out there and committing these mass homicidal rampages. It's always these kids from well-to-do families who can afford to send the kid for psychological treatment, which inevitably means they're going to give him all of these pills. And we know that this guy in Santa Barbara, Elliot Rogers, was on risperidone and Xanax and probably a bunch of others as well. I mean, he was on Vicodin apparently. And Vicodin doesn't trigger violence, but Xanax does. It's well documented. It isn't the kids and it isn't the guns. It is these medications. And the TV corporate news doesn't want to talk about it because they are dependent on those very lucrative pharmaceutical commercials. And by the way, the United States is one of only 2 industrialized nations that allows pharmaceutical advertising on TV for prescription medication. You want new Damitol and go to your doctor and ask for the note. And the other nations have said, no, this is inappropriate ways of handling public health. And Congress held hearings about this problem, and they acknowledged there's a problem, but they didn't do anything about it because those pharmaceutical lobbyists write very big campaign donation checks. And so we're out here catching the bullets, and every time there's another one of these meltdowns, oh, it's the guns, we've got to take away the guns.
Well, the basic thing is, on a state level, I think we ought to be contacting our state legislatures trying to nullify this gun law, saying nobody will be denied the right to keep and bear arms until they are adjudicated by a judge and a jury of their peers.
That would probably be a good way to do it. I mean, okay, I will concede there are people that shouldn't be allowed to carry guns. Right now, the police force strikes me as a good idea, if you want to talk about public safety, because since 9/11, the American police forces have murdered 8 times as many innocent Americans as the terrorists have. But we're supposed to ignore that because they have good intentions and the terrorists are evil people that we must oppose. But the reality is there is a problem with these medications. And while I would agree that if somebody absolutely has a history of violence, and I say history of violence and crime, that yes, it is prudent to not allow them access to weapons. But to go out there with this bill saying that if the government determines you're mentally ill, you lose your Second Amendment rights, that's right out of the Soviet Union, because the government is already saying 1/4 of you suffer mental illness. Okay, so look at your 3 closest friends, and if they're acting normally, you're it. And they will take away your gun rights. Okay, George? All right, we're going to let you go here. Now, here's a very interesting story. This came out of Gawker.com, and it has to do with the fact that the Beretta Firearms Company apparently put out briefly an article on how to hide your gun from the jackboots, and was basically suggestions about if you have a firearm that you don't want intruders into your home to locate, these are the ways where you could find ways to conceal it. Well, the post got pulled. It was over at guns.com. The URL leads to a 404. And Beretta has deleted all reference to it. Somebody apparently made a phone call saying, look, when we kick down the doors of innocent law-abiding Americans to confiscate their home defense weapons, their instruments of terror, we don't want you guys making our job any harder. It's just crazy out there. Now then, getting on over to the VA scandal, which continues to get worse and worse and worse. There was an article that came out, and this is actually on CNN, that performance bonuses to the top officials at the Veterans Administration, or Veterans Affairs rather, were tied to those VA wait times. And that a lot of this manipulation and the push for the secret waiting list was tied to performance goals for bonuses. It wasn't just reassuring Americans that everybody who comes to the VA sees somebody within 2 weeks' time. Their bonuses were tied into it. And so a lot of veterans got put on those secret waiting lists and left to die for the sake of a slightly fatter paycheck. I think this has crossed the line into outright murder for profit. Now then, more news coming about the F-35. Biggest boondoggle in U.S. military history. The current price tag for 2,400 aircraft is $400 billion. That's twice what the nation spent to put man on the moon. The program is 7 years behind schedule, $163 billion over budget. The plane still can't be put into active service. The helmet fire control system will not work. Can't fly in fog, rain, or near lightning, or the electronics stop working. It is so junked up and heavy that it can't win a dogfight against the current contemporary Russian-Chinese jets. Huge amounts of spending going on there. And it's not just the F-35. F-22, the Independence-class littoral combat ships, they're having major problems with that new aircraft carrier, the one where they replaced steam catapults with the magnetic rail gun. Can't even get the elevators on that one to work. Now, let's see. We're coming up on another commercial break here. I'm going to tease this one story in. We're getting into the economy. British taxpayers may lose their entire, you'll pardon the expression, investment, £45 billion in the Royal Bank of Scotland. Apparently, it may collapse from what is being described as a £100 billion black hole, which apparently was not made abundantly clear when they went to the government for a taxpayer bailout. It's all starting to unravel. We got to take a break for commercials, and we'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, getting back to the disconnect of our Skype feed at show start and the temporary interruption of service to the What Really Happened server. I actually have two different internet service providers. I have the one for the whatreallyhappened.com web page, which is a dedicated server, and then for my other web pages, like my wife's music page, my animation page, and stuff like that, I go to a completely separate company. I just got an email from that separate company that at the same time the What Really Happened website was taken down, there was a DOS attack against the server on my other websites at the same time. So somebody's trying to make a point. And they took steps, and all of the sites are back up and running, but obviously I've annoyed somebody who thinks the internet and everybody else's computers belong to them. So take a read through all the stories at whatreallyhappened.com today and try and guess what's the one that really set them off today here. All right, getting on back to the economy. There's a story we just put up here, and this is from Ben Swan, on the Federal Housing Finance Agency and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau are going to seize all financial records on every mortgage in the United States for a new federal database. I can't even begin to imagine what they think it's going to accomplish, but they seem to be getting into this idea that everything about your life, it has to be in one of their databases. Total information awareness, full spectrum dominance, whatever the buzzword they want to use. And none of this is the government's business. If you're going through Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, which are linked to the government, I could see maybe a justification. But if you've gone to your local neighborhood bank to get a mortgage and you're making the payments just fine, it's none of the government's business. None whatsoever. Now, from around the world, we are hearing about governments that have the brass ones to actually go after some of these crooked bankers. We know that following the collapse of the mortgage-backed security fraud in 2008, Iceland threw their crooked bankers in jail, and they fired the government that helped them loot the people. Vietnam has executed some of their corrupt criminal bankers. Iran just hung one, the richest man in their entire country, and they strung him up. And now over in Spain, their court has just scored their first conviction of bankers since the beginning of the crisis. But there's kind of a weird story going on here. Okay? These 4 guys who got convicted have made an offer to the court that they will return the 28 million euros in cash they stole from retirement plans, or rather they stole from the bank to give themselves if they could stay out of jail. Okay? So what the bankers are going in, let's say that you've held up a convenience store and you get arrested and you go before the judge and say, look, judge, I'll give back everything I stole if you will let me stay out of jail. That's what these bankers are demanding of the court. Court will probably go along with it. Oh, yeah, just, give back all that you stole, say that you're sorry, and you get to go home. Now, an article coming out of Investment Watch blog, the velocity of money in the U.S. falls to an all-time record low. What do we mean by the velocity of money? Well, basically it means how fast, how much money is actually in circulation, rather than simply sitting in a bank account, sitting in a mayonnaise jar, sitting in a pocket. How much actual activity is going on where currency is changing hands, that's the velocity of money. And it's at an all-time record low. People aren't buying things. People aren't spending money. They're not investing. They're not hiring. They're not building. We've already seen reports over the last several weeks about what's called Retail-mageddon, where all of these major retailers are shutting stores and letting people go. And I'm getting emails from other people who work for less visible companies that they're having half their staff let go or going out of business completely. We're all seeing the retailers close their doors because they're out there to be visible. That's part of what retail is, a store with a big name above it. But behind that store, in the industrial parks, there are all kinds of other businesses most Americans don't see. You don't go driving around the industrial park and looking for what businesses are open or closed, but they are closing just as rapidly as the retail. The entire system is grinding to a halt. That is what is signaled by this velocity of money in the U.S. falls to an all-time record low. Another article out of Wall Street on Parade. Is the market crazy? Treasuries are screaming crisis, while the stock market continues to tick along slightly in the green. In fact, it's slightly in the green again today. And basically this article makes the point, when there is this much of a disconnect between the bond market and the stock market, obviously the stock market is being rigged. It's another confirmation of what we've been saying since the Clinton administration brought in the plunge protection team. The government and the bankers are manipulating the stock market, first of all, to make instant profits out of thin air, and because the government still uses that stock market as their economic banner. See, the stock market is way, way up here, and if you're out of a job and you've lost your home and you're hungry, it's your own fault. We're doing a great job. Look at the stock market. See, the stock market is up. Things must really be good out there. And the reality is we have descended back to the same situation that Americans were in back in that whole meltdown of 2007, 2008. Americans are once again taking loans out on the equity in their home just to pay their month-to-month bills. They're cashing out their equity for those who still have equity. So many homes are underwater right now, they can't even do that. Another report out of Investment Watch blog, the first quarter of 2014, the retail numbers for the brick and mortar operations, the storefronts, their term, they suck. It's all grinding to a halt because the weight on the American economy from out-of-control government debt and interest paid on the public currency, which shouldn't be happening at all to begin with, has just crushed our economy down to where it's absolutely stalemated right now. The number of homeowners under the age of 35 is the lowest it's been since 1982, which is when they started keeping records. And by the way, if you're looking at buying a house, your student loan debt is now going to be considered when you apply for a mortgage. So if you went to college for a better job and you undertook about $50,000, $60,000 in student loans, that debt is now going to be part of the information the mortgage company will look at to see if they're going to give you a mortgage to buy your home. And we know that we've got generations now of kids who went to college, did the academic achievement, had to take out student loans because scholarships dried up and the cost of college has soared way out of proportion to the rate of inflation, to force them onto that debt machine. And they graduate, and those high-paying jobs, they were told, justified a college degree are not here, and they're struggling with that debt. And now, because of a change in the rules in calculating for a mortgage, they're not going to be able to buy a house. Another story coming out of Huffington Post. Debt collectors have now figured out a way to directly seize your wages and savings. They're taking debtors to court to get the judge to issue liens and confiscation. And according to consumer advocates, the people who have this debt are not being notified so that they can show up and defend themselves. So the debt collection agency goes before the judge, says, we want to take the money. The judge says, sure, they're not here to say anything else. Go ahead and take it. The entire machine is geared to loot the American people to please the money junkies. And the justice system is not just. You're supposed to be notified of any court action against you. And consumer advocates are saying it's just not happening. The notifications get lost somehow. It's another engineered scam here. Final little story before the top of the hour, and this is over at ellenbrown.com, called Infrastructure Sticker Shock. And it's a point we've made before. When you have a government that issues a bond to finance some public facility, they'll tell you what the facility will cost, but they don't tell you what the ultimate interest is going to cost the taxpayer. And it will be more than the construction. The bankers make more money off the facility just for typing into a computer than the people who actually build it. We'll be right back with David Maryland and taxes. And aloha, America. Welcome to our show, hour number 3. And joining us on the phone now is David Maryland. You just heard his voice in that commercial. It's perfect timing. David, thank you for spending time with us today.
Hi, great to be here. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now just fine here. And I've been listening to your commercial here on the broadcast for over a week now, and obviously it's piqued mine and a lot of other people's curiosity. And before we get into the nitty-gritty about what you found, would you tell our listeners a little bit about who you are, how you came to basically examine the tax code, the depth that you examined it at, and sort of give us the background before we get into Section 83?
Sure. 1976, I graduated high school in Washington State as the All-American boy with one goal, which was to go to the 1980 Olympics and win the high jump for the United States and wave the red, white, and blue. And now, all these years later, my country makes me sick. I've looked too closely and stood under the watchful eye of the government right next to the tendencies of government for so long that we have an intimate relationship, believe it. And in 1988, I was capable of slam dunking basketballs, and you couldn't beat me around a bar. And as the world's fastest bartender, the IRS came to my door, and I took exception to the way they treated me. Started studying tax law in June of 1988, and this has to be underscored that I wasn't assured that if I were to investigate tax law, I would find anything wrong. It wasn't my goal to find out that the IRS was entirely unlawful. It was simply to understand why exactly I could be treated the way I was treated. 6 years later, I completed a treatise, which was a briefing of over a dozen discrepancies between the tax code and the Internal Revenue Service standard operating procedures that show that the tax code is complex for a reason. They hide inside the tax code when, in fact, the IRS is a paper tiger. The limits on their authority, the way that the taxes are supposed to be imposed if you honored the law, are entirely different than what you see the IRS doing on a day-to-day basis. Entirely different. And what I found, if you pictured the tax code on the left, which I say is perfect, I'd love to have the tax code. And on the far right, you got the IRS that's totally different. In the middle, you have a bunch of regulations that the executive branch wrote that changed the shape of the law to equal the IRS. I found a list of regulations that twist the statutes or provide room for argument where really if all you did was look at statute, you'd find no room for argument. And I briefed all of these, and since 2006, my 1994 treatise has prevented over 10 indictments by turning off Criminal Investigations Division investigation into the affairs of individuals. In Criminal Investigations Division, that's a division of the Internal Revenue Service that warms up a case for prosecution by the Department of Justice. And when I have found, with the help of one other guy in Florida, that when you hit Criminal Investigations Division with my treatise, it augments the trouble that lies in wait for the government if they were to seek an indictment. They'll always, in my experience, they'll always get your money. But when you have, in addition to due process rights, the rights of the accused under the 6th and 7th Amendments, rights to face your accuser, rights to call witnesses, rights to a jury trial, rights to counsel, it elevates the burden on the government so drastically that when you add proof, statute has always protected you, it combines to fortify the likelihood against indictment.
Okay,
So
I want to.
I'm not.
I want to interrupt you for a minute and go back and kind of recap. And by the way, we've got about 50 minutes before the end of the show, and I have no reason for you to leave before the end of the show here. But basically you're saying there is the actual tax code on one side, and on the other side there's what the IRS is telling everybody they owe, and in the middle are a bunch of executive orders that take the tax code and sort of change it to suit the IRS's grabbing of your money. Now, little reminder, the president is not allowed to simply write laws out of thin air in the executive orders. We know that Obama's doing it. We know that Bill Clinton was doing it. They used to joke about stroke of the pen, law of the land, but it is all very much illegal. I'm all for definitely increasing the burden of proof on the government, because certainly I think the vast majority of Americans understand now that anything the government claims has to be taken with a great deal of salt.
And I didn't say executive orders. I said executive branch regulations. They happen to have been written by the Secretary of the Treasury. Tax regulations.
Okay, but basically... Okay, I'm not sure where we are on that one, because, again, the Secretary of the Treasury is supposed to be in compliance with the U.S. tax code itself. So,
correct.
Yeah, okay. All right, please continue.
And when they said about promulgating regulations under particular statutes, they played with the law in ways that makes it sound like the IRS can do what it does, when, in fact, if you look at a lot of these regulations, you find, this is null and void. You're taking authority out of thin air by writing this regulation. A great example of this is the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company versus FDA case on the 4th Circuit, East Coast, tobacco country. The tobacco company looked at the Food and Drug Act and said there's no authority to regulate tobacco in the Food and Drug Act. In fact, with what the Food and Drug Administration has said in the past before, if tobacco were within the authority of them, of the agency to regulate, they'd have to ban the sale of tobacco tomorrow. So, no, they dreamed up all their authority through regulation alone, and the tobacco company kicked the FDA's butt all the way through the U.S. Supreme Court. All the courts agreed that you wrote a bunch of regulations to get the authority you're wielding in relation to tobacco. You have to shut that branch of the FDA down. That's the sort of challenge I make to certain parts of the tax code.
Okay, because
the IRS.
The IRS, which is a private corporation working for a privately owned bank, the Treasury Department can't just create regulations without a statutory base to them. And what I'm hearing from you, and this is certainly not the first time we've heard it, is that these government agencies are simply writing regulations to expand their power and authority, but without having a proper legal foundation for them, as in a statute passed by the Congress and signed by the President of the United States.
It's not simply at all. It's not at all simple. It's extremely complex. It's a quagmire, but there are cornerstones of their authority. When you look at statute, they have several different things they can do, and when you look at what they can do and go and find the statute that authorizes it, in many instances you find at the root of their authority is a very narrowly drawn statute in a regulation that says, oh no, we're going to include a whole bunch of other stuff.
Okay, it's authority creep. All right, David, we have to take a 3-minute break for commercials. We'll be back with David Merland after these few words. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. We're talking with David Merland, who has studied the tax code from beginning to end, a Herculean task, because it is very complex, deliberately so that ordinary Americans don't understand that many of these regulations thrown at you to take your money do not, in fact, have a solid statutory foundation. And by the way, I just got an email asking David if you could explain tax code versus constitutional law and the gap between those two. David, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. There's a gap between enforcement and the Constitution. The tax code honors a limited federal government. It honors all property as a cost, including your labor. It honors the concept of voluntary compliance, and only through regulation, in some instances of outright misenforcement, do you find the enforcement of what they say they're enforcing the tax code is false. Their enforcement is illegitimate and unconstitutional when, in fact, the tax code is perfect. Let me say a couple things to RBN listeners. Get the opportunity to hear a lineup like Ben Swan, Michael Rivero, and John Stadmiller just anywhere. When you look at what these guys do every day, they've got their thumb on the pulse of so many things that it's a treasure to have a daytime lineup like this where they simply don't waste any of your time, and the full spectrum of analysis as well as reporting and journalism, their guests, you just can't find this anywhere else. And I would urge you to do whatever you can for RBN to make sure they can continue providing this vital service. And it is my privilege to announce that Saturday mornings now, 7 a.m. Eastern, my show, No Confidence, will be on the air for an hour. So while we'll really put in a small box for the purposes of this interview, every Saturday morning I'm going to be discussing plenty of issues inside the tax code, the right to travel, and these are all issues I explore statutorily. I only rely on written law. I don't have theories like the quote-unquote movement is so famous for, or infamous, nefarious, for concocting. So my feet are always on the ground. I've read over 4,000 decisions. All my knowledge comes from judges and through all this case law that I've read. And Saturday morning, starting this coming Saturday, it's my pleasure and privilege to provide 1 hour on RBN here. I just can't wait. Now, the tax code, as I said, it honors...
Well, before you go any further, let me welcome you to RBN here. And obviously, this is information Americans need to know, especially with the realization that along with Saddam's weapons of mass destruction and the state of the economy and the unemployment numbers and human-caused global warming, oh, my stars and garters, you're telling me that the government has been lying to us about the legality of the income tax? Horrors is nothing sacred.
Yeah. It's proving it. That's the hard part. And as I stated, my 1994 treatise, that's 20 years ago. I was done. And so this is nothing new. And I'm not a new guy to any of this. You haven't heard of me because I'm not part of the movement. I ignore everybody else out there. I'm independent because the volume of research that I've done has me arguing different places in the law than anybody else. And so I have to remain independent or slow down to accommodate others who haven't done the work. And it's tragic because I've seen people die from stress because of tax matters. I've seen innocent people go to prison, and it's out of line. I'm more responsible than that. I don't have a prescription of something you should do other than get a home business and collect all the allowable deductions that H&R Block says you can get away with, and look at the amount you've paid at the end of the year as your price of admission to a shouting match with your congressman. It's all you can get in America. So I can show you how they're illegal, overtly, criminally enforcing the tax code, but there's not a whole lot you can do against what they do. I've done the impossible. I've prevented indictment. And
well, I'd like to insert a small comment here. Everybody listening to this show, you probably already understand, but I'm going to recapitulate it anyway. That judge's salary comes from tax revenue. That big building that the court is in comes from tax revenue. All those people in uniforms walking around with their guns and pepper spray and handcuffs, it's all paid by tax revenues. They have a clear conflict of interest going in. They are not predisposed to be sympathetic to anybody who wants to hang on to their own money. And I think that was illustrated by a lawsuit called Sullivan versus United States. Now, Sullivan sued the United States government to stop the war in Iraq on the basis that George Bush did not really have statutory authority to go off and declare war on Iraq without a constitutional declaration. And the judge, James C. Fox, took the position that the government will do things that are outside the letter of the law, but they get away with it long enough and sort of go along with what they know to be a fraud. And he chose as his specific example the 16th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States of America, which he admits right there in the court case failed ratification. And then he goes on to say, but, we need this to be the law, and we're just going to go on doing that. So none of this that you're hearing on the show is legal advice or a recommendation of a course of action. It is simply acknowledging that you are the victims of a corrupted, dishonest, and fraudulent system.
The health care bill is another great example of custom and practice. We've done it long enough. Now it's not going to be repealed. Horse feathers. What I can do to Obamacare with my 1994 treatise proves that all the health care bill is a plug-in to the same fraud they've always committed against us with the tax code. It took me 5 hours of analysis to defeat Obamacare with my 1994 treatise on the tax code. Half of the health care bill is an amendment to the Social Security Act. 1/6 of it is an amendment to Chapter 1 of the tax code. I can obliterate both of them on accident. If you just slow down and look at a few statutes, you go, excuse me, but they've been stealing from us for decades. Look at just this proof, and it's at the foundation of the Social Security Act. You go, it's over. It's over. They're stealing from us every day. It's a felony. I can arrest a felon, state to state, circuit to circuit, across the United States. These people are subject to citizen's arrest, if not justifiable homicide.
Well, I don't want to cross that line. I don't want to cross that line. I agree. Citizens
are okay. I'm not saying go do it. I'm saying the law operates that way. And so when you can convince a public servant it's a bad idea to get me into that court, the judge can be arrested. I'm not saying I will, but I'm saying your conduct makes it so that 317 plus million Americans can do it if they choose. What were you thinking? It's that bad. With what I can prove so quickly and so simply, and I'll do it on the air cheerfully, have a pen and piece of paper handy. I do this all the time. I've been lecturing on law for 22 years. And it is simple to get to the very basic of a lot of what they get from us, and it's overtly illegal.
Okay, we're going to have to come up on another commercial break. This one's going to last about 4.5 minutes, or 4 minutes and 10 seconds. And when we come on back, I'd like you to continue. Okay, David?
Of course.
All right, we'll be back after these words from our sponsors. Hi, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking with David Merland, who has done decades of study of the actual tax code. And you need to understand that is the actual letter of the tax law, as opposed to all of these regulations that are simply being written, often out of thin air, by the Treasury Department and the Internal Revenue Service. And before we go any further, because I'm going to keep you on until the end of the show, David, here, your ad here at RBN is basically where people can, correct me if I'm wrong, they can acquire a copy of this treatise that you wrote 20 years ago. Is that correct?
From Caesar.us. Take from Caesar.us. There's a manual that I wrote in 1994 about Tax Code Section 83 that I added a 30-page epilogue to a couple of months ago and got an ISBN number on it, so it's up to date. You'll have case law from 1979 through 2011, circuit cases and tax court cases that say Section 83 applies to all compensation for services for employees and self-employed. It explains how to tax it. It governs the taxation of compensation, and yet H&R Block, J.K. Harris, Ronnie Deutsch, the IRS, certified public accountants, enrolled agents to the IRS. Those are people that take classes every year to retain their certification so they can represent you at audit or in tax court. None of them ever receive any instruction whatsoever on Section 83 of the tax code. I'm the only one in the known universes that teaches anything about it. And in that manual, there's nothing left to say about Section 83, and there's no questions left unanswered about Section 83. That manual is the first, last, and final word on the operation of that statute. The government won't even go on record with its own interpretation of Section 83, and yet the judicial branch concurs that it explains how to tax your paycheck. I have issues with that.
Okay, would you...
And it doesn't say that the whole paycheck's gross income like the IRS does either. It says if, in connection with the performance of services, property is transferred, the excess of the value of that property over the amount paid shall be included in gross income. And it defines the amount paid in regulation as the value of any money or property that I paid for my paycheck. Labor's property. Its value is what an unrelated party is willing to give me in an arm's length transaction. I didn't get anything in excess. Here would be an example of excess. Dave, you sold more vacuum cleaners than anybody else in the company, in the whole country, in the third quarter of this year. Here's a $4,000 bonus. I didn't contract for that. That's gross income. But the rest of it is the contract value of my labor, my pension, my sick pay, vacation pay, company parking spot, company automobile, my lunches that the company bought for me, my wages, tips, salaries, commissions. All of that is within the contract value of my labor. And Section 83 says the value of any money or property that you paid for your compensation is an amount paid, and only the excess is gross income.
Now, I've heard that before. I wasn't aware of exactly where the statute was on that one. Can you spell your website for us, please?
Take from Caesar, C-A-E-S-A-R.
Okay.
C-A-E-S-A-R. Take from Caesar.us. Take from Caesar that which is not Caesar's.
Okay, I'm looking at it right now, and I'm certainly going to post it to whatreallyhappened.com here. But again, I think probably 20 years ago when you wrote this treatise, probably you would have presented it to people and they said, oh, I mean, the government would never lie to us about the income tax. And, of course, today we're a much sadder but wiser American people where we've come to understand the government lies to us about everything, first and foremost to get our money. Human-caused global warming is a good example of that. So we've got about another 5 minutes left in this segment. What else would you like to share with our listeners?
I thought you'd never ask. We have U.S. District Court that has, in a particular decision, articulated why this challenge to Title 18 of the United States Code is an invalid challenge. The challenge is that there's a statute in there that gives U.S. District Court its jurisdiction over criminal cases, but that it was signed by the House, given to the Senate. The Senate made amendments, went on a break, came back, gave it back to the House, and the House never voted on the amendment, and it went to Truman and was signed into law. And the district courts say, Congress gave us jurisdiction. We had a statute before that one, even if the argument was valid. And so we have jurisdiction. What that judge just said was that we get our jurisdiction from statute. Congress created the court. What Congress gives, Congress can take away. We have medical marijuana statutes on a state level, maybe even a constitutional provision like Colorado has. We have gay marriage legislation, and some states had constitutional amendments against it, and yet federal district court overturns it. 28 U.S.C., that's Title 28 of the United States Code about the judiciary, 1738, says all enactments and decisions of a state shall be given their full faith and credit in U.S. District Court. Well, how do you give full faith and credit to a law that you strike down as unconstitutional? There's a statute that Congress wrote that limits U.S. District Court's jurisdiction to hear cases that contradict a state law or a state Supreme Court decision. Why is it me coming up with this? I'm not the lawyer out there trying to defend these states. And here's a statute that clearly says it's Congress saying basically U.S. District Court doesn't have jurisdiction to overturn a state law. You have to go to an Article 4 court, which is a constitutional court, not an Article 3 court, which is a statutory creation. Anyway, that's another example of when you look at the law closely enough and you take your time, you can find some things that are earth-shattering. They shape the foundation of what government does to its foundation.
Well, again, when we were kids, when we were at the height of the Cold War, we were very gullible, naive, trusting people, where we simply assumed that anything we were being told by the politicians, by the courts, by the corporate TV media had to be the absolute unvarnished truth. Today, we know better. We are lied to constantly. The American people are the most lied to people on the face of the earth, and so it shouldn't come as a surprise that the government is misrepresenting the actual statutes in order to assert more control over the states. Although I'm happy to read that they're now pulling back from this insistence of imposing federal law on the states where its marijuana has been decriminalized. But power always seeks more power, wealth always seeks more wealth, and these are not particularly honorable and honest people. That is the lesson of the 21st century. And I think most Americans now understand.
Let's go back to the 50s. Let's look at the early 60s. Television shows. Those were not fantasy. Kids were like you see on Leave It to Beaver. And these deviants stood back and said, how can we fleece these way too trusting, nice, soft, gentle people? And they did it.
No, they absolutely did. And I'm old enough to remember that, yeah, that's how we were back then. I was a child of the 50s. I was a farm kid and had absolutely no idea that this kind of stuff went on. Now we know differently.
Oh, and look what's right at the front right now. These progressives have waged war on childhood for decades. It's gone. You don't find innocent children these days. There are pockets. I'm not saying every child, but with what they're taught is normal and the sewer that is pop culture, it's utterly abhorrent to me what children are allowed to become, much less encouraged to become.
Well, I agree with you on that one. I mean, my my approach is we should let kids stay kids for as long as they possibly can, because growing old is a one-way street. But they're being driven to adulthood by mass merchandising. You want to be grown up. You want to wear the correct fashions. You want to have this. You want to have that. And it's all driven. It's all driven by greed and money junkie behavior to the detriment of our society. And don't get me wrong, I don't have a problem with people being rich, like Steve Jobs or James Cameron. What I do have a problem with is that lust for money destroying what was best in the American character. We got to take another commercial break. One final segment with David Merland after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the last segment of our show today, and we're keeping David Merland on until the very end. And, David, before I hand the microphone back to you, I'm looking through your website. I got to tell you, we're getting a ton of email on you and the issues that you raise and a bunch of questions which we're not going to have time for. So obviously I'm going to have you back on my show at some point. And a reminder that David now has his own show here on the Republic Broadcasting Network on Saturday morning. What is the time slot again, please?
7 a.m. Eastern until 8 a.m. Eastern.
Okay, 7 a.m. Eastern, Saturday mornings. David's going to be on the radio talking about all of this and the fact that, yes, once again, the government is lying to the American people to obtain their money through fraudulent means. We've got about maybe 10 minutes left to go here. Just take off and tell our listeners what you want them to hear.
Okay, 123 at takefromcaesar.us, 123 at takefromcaesar.us. You can email me directly. I work with one other man. This man he called me up in March 2006 and said, gosh, they're really heating it up with me at the IRS there. You got any ideas? I just heard from a friend of mine, heard your name and never heard of you before. And I said, well, I just filed a criminal complaint with 80 members of Congress. Cost me $6,000 to send 80 members of Congress 180 pages. And 33 pages of that is a racketeering and extortion complaint based on my treatise, because they can't refute a word of it. A 58-page memorandum and some exhibits. You want to join your IRS agents as similarly situated criminals? They said, yeah, why don't we do that? So we joined them as criminals to that criminal complaint and served all of them. They turned it over to the Criminal Investigations Division, and then he manufactured a bunch more copies and served all their agents. And then by late summer, they turned it over to the Department of Justice for an indictment. And he photocopied a bunch more times, served all the local U.S. attorneys down there in Florida. And in December, he received a subpoena to appear before the grand jury to provide handwriting exemplars. And with my coaching, appeared before the grand jury and said, I'll give you all the handwriting exemplars you want. I'm here to give you everything you want today. But I'm also here to tell you I am not here as a defendant. I'm here as a criminal counter-complainant. They don't deny a word of it. They should be in prison. And he gave the grand jury foreperson a copy of that criminal complaint that went to Congress along with his affidavit of joinder, and never heard from him again. And now he's my promoter.
Well, good for him.
He calls my 58-pager his second Bible. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think given the fact that the IRS regulations seem to be disconnected from their statutory foundation, and especially given the IRS already vile reputation even before the targeting of political dissidents, I think they're just going to tend to be leery of any situation that is going to add to the negative press. And again, I'm not a lawyer, David's not a lawyer, and none of this is legal advice or a recommendation for a course of action. But I think if all 300 million Americans stood up at the same time and said, we're tired of being lied to about this stuff, I think we might see some changes happening.
I would hope so. And keep in mind, exhibit number 1 in that complaint to 80 members of Congress was a protective order that U.S. District Court in Austin, Texas issued against a memorandum I filed. I had a client in Austin, Texas, said I might be indicted for failure to file. I said, how would you like an exhibit that proves you sued the United States for proof the tax code applies to Americans and they can't debate you on 3 or 4 statutes? He says, let's go for it. So he filed a lawsuit with a memorandum attached saying, all I want out of this lawsuit is answers to these questions if these 3 conclusions are mistaken. And Assistant U.S. Attorney Stephen Bass asked the court for a protective order against the 12 questions, and U.S. District Judge Lee Yeakel issued the protective order.
Okay, what does that mean by a protective order? That you can't, that you've got legitimate questions and you can't bring them.
You are hereby prohibited from asking these questions of our poor U.S. attorneys.
Boy, that sounds like flashing guilty sign. I know that when Bill Benson came out with his book, The Law That Never Was, that documents what Judge James C. Fox said in Sullivan versus United States. The 16th Amendment actually failed ratification. The courts have basically said this book may not ever be introduced in any tax law cases.
And that's a political issue you have to take up with Congress.
Which Congress won't do a thing about it.
It's all horse feathers, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. Well, actually, it's from the other end of the horse.
They'll find a direction they can run, and then they'll run as far as they have to, no matter how bad they have to look doing it, and you can't have the law. But there's some real simple things you can confront them with, and that's what I've devised in my treatise, which will eventually be available. The only things on Take from Caesar right now are the Section 83 manual, and then a manual about a very curious, peculiar phrase that if you went to Google and you typed in open as a matter of right to public vehicular travel, open as a matter of right to public vehicular travel, you'll get 7 million hits. It's in the law from coast to coast that highways are open as a matter of right. And I filed with Kurt Ragan, my best friend in Colorado, I filed a criminal complaint with the Homeland Security Committee in Congress March 9th of 06, and with the Department of Justice alleging everybody involved in the misenforcement of the Motor Vehicle Code against public vehicular travelers that they're extortionists and racketeers. Never heard word one back from it. And that complaint, when you join your judge and your prosecutor and your cop and your city or county, whoever cited you to that complaint, and file your motion to dismiss into your case, they always instruct the cop to not appear so that they can dismiss the case without getting into the topic of public vehicular travel.
Yeah, it's a dirty system. It absolutely is a dirty system. The justice system is not just.
But to prove it with statute is the hard part. That's what I do.
Well, the U.S. government has, for well over a century, existed solely on their ability to convince the American people that what they say is right, the truth, and the law, and be believed. And those days are gone. There's really a panic going on in the halls of power that they have created a credibility crisis where the American people just don't trust anything this government says any longer. And they're trying to figure out some way they can regain that. And the more we start digging and going public on all of these misapplications of the law, outright fraud, judges who will absolutely refuse to let law or exonerating evidence come into the courtroom, the more obvious it becomes that we really, unfortunately, have descended into exactly the kind of governmental tyranny the founding fathers of this nation hoped to avoid. Personally,
right, and I'd like to provide a simple, provable footing for somebody to simply say, "This is over. You've always been stealing from us, and it's over. That traffic court's a racketeering scheme. So is the IRS. And if you don't shut it down, heaven help you."
I'm hearing that from a lot of people. And again, I'm not encouraging any kind of a violent uprising. I am still convinced that if we just sit and delink from the system, pull your money out of the banks and the stock market, invest in physical silver and gold, this whole Federal Reserve Ponzi scheme is about to implode on itself, and it will take the federal government with it.
We can only hope, right?
Well, again, looking at, there are so many similarities between the current United States and the Soviet Union just before its collapse, and it's only a matter of time. And frankly, I'm amazed they kept it together as long as they did. One more time for our listeners before the end of the show, when is your show on RBN?
Saturday mornings, 7 a.m. Eastern till 8 a.m. Eastern. You can email me at 123@takefromcaesar.us.
All right, so that's 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. Eastern Time here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. And I'll tell you right now, David, I'm certainly going to be tuning in. Okay.
And the show is called No Confidence. My name is David Merlin.
All right, David, we got to let you go. The music is playing. It's time for me to get out of here and get some errands done with the rest of the day. We will be back tomorrow here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. I got a ton of stuff left over from today's talking points. Until tomorrow, stay safe, stay well, stay informed, make good choices, stay skeptical, stay angry. Now's the time. Please support Republic Broadcasting. Hit that donate button at the top of the webpage. Buy physical silver and gold from Republic Trading Group. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.